Hello and welcome to the tutorial regarding how to do 3D paint in Maya. And this is something where you can actually use Maya as a paint program. And it's best done to fix little areas that are troublesome to get at otherwise, such as this low poly character here. There's some trouble spots, not just with kind of geometry all over the map, but also these seams where the cow texture is. You can see that there's a misalignment here, and there's also areas where it just kind of cuts off, and patch on the butt and all that. It's constrained by the geometry and the way the UVs were laid out. And if you look at the way that the UVs were laid out, you can see the reasoning behind this, which is that there's a sudden cutoff. If I turn off the image, there's a sudden cutoff, or better yet, let's just kind of darken it. Here in these seams between the body and the arms, like this edge and this edge. So if you look here in the UV editor, you can see that there's just a huge fall off between the space allotted for this edge, which is simultaneously this edge here. So there's no continuity. It's very hard to get to this. It's very hard for me to paint in Photoshop in this area with any accuracy. There's really not a lot of freedom there for me to know exactly that if I paint a small cow circle right there, that I'll know exactly where that corresponds to over here. Plus, there's a sudden drop off. Let's take a look at this edge in particular. This edge has two of its it comes from the body, which is over here, but these next two edges actually align to a completely different part in the UV map. So this is doubly hard to get. It's full of stretching. It's full of again, spots that just kind of ramble all over the character. And what if I wanted to touch up the pattern? It just seems to be cut up between so many different separate shells that it's going to be extremely difficult for me to try and fix this if I'm not painting right on the 3D character. So luckily there's a way to do this, and this is a perfect example to show you how to paint in 3D. But we do need to set some things up first, and that is that if you go over to rendering and then under texturing, there is a 3D paint tool. What you want to do is you want to always go to the options, because that's what brings up the tool set you're going to need. If you just go to texturing 3D paint tool, it doesn't bring it up. The second thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you've got your directory set up in Maya so that you know the project is going to be working from. The reason you want to do that is what's going to happen is the texture that you've assigned to Maya, let's say that you've got this this texture that you've done previously in Photoshop, and I've set it up in Maya, and it's got a nice connection coming into it. The problem is that if you don't want to paint over your textures, then you're in a little bit of a quandary, because it's referencing the texture, but you don't want to paint over the texture. So there's a lot going on here where you don't want to destroy the existing work, but you do want to be able to consistently manipulate it. So what Maya does is it makes a new shader for you while using your original shader. This is the original shader I put on the character. It leaves that one untouched. So I've got a PSD file here that it's reading in, and it's I don't want to necessarily mess with that. So Maya's going to create a different shader while I'm painting in 3D over it based on this shader. So it's going to create it in the default area that you've assigned it to, wittingly or not, by opening Maya. So come up to File and go to Project Window, and you'll see this is the directory you want. So what I've got is I've got this kind of default area. We all, unless you've specifically assigned your project to be in a particular location in Maya, it always sets it up under your documents, and then usually under Maya projects, that's kind of the default space. And I've assigned this to a class that I'm teaching here. So what I want to do is I don't want all this subdirectory stuff. All I really want is source images. And I can go in here and reassign it to the area that I really want to go, which is completely different because that's where it's going to create that duplicate shader. And I want it to be accessible. I want to know where it is. So if I come up here to Cowpunk Work, great, now I know I'm dealing with this area. And it's going to be easy for me to find where Maya is saving my copy of a shader. Okay, so let's jump in. The minute that I've assigned it to reference this PSD file, and it's under Cowpunk here. In fact, let's go into the work directory. Let's put it in test 3D paint. It's kind of the same thing. It's a copy of the PSD file. It's actually in the folder work. I want to make it the same place where Maya is going to be creating its duplicate shader, which is check out here in project window in work. So everything's going to be coming from and saved to the same directory, so I don't have to run all over the place. So from here we can come into the 3D paint tool. Again, remember not to just click on the paint tool, but bring up the settings and get rid of the hypershade because we don't need it at this point. So before we begin, come down here, whoops, come down and make sure that what you've selected, first things first, is go down to assign edit textures. Okay, it's going to ask you, all right, so I'm going to create this duplicate shader that we're going to work with, and I'm going to capture each of your strokes onto this duplicate shader, and more importantly, a duplicate texture. So the PSD file that I showed you it's accessing right now, it's going to create a duplicate of that in the same work folder, and I'm kind of ready to go. But this is the initial command to Maya. Do create a 512 by 512. Those are the numbers I've delineated. I want it to be a PSD file because I want to go in there and modify it further, and I want to assign the texture. So at this point, what we can do is just to validate things. I tend to keep a folder up of the work so that I can see whatever Maya is saving. So what I'm going to be doing is coming in here and painting over my character, and this is where I can start curing the seams. The first thing I want to do is make sure the brush size is reasonable. So I'm going to be holding down the B key. Whoops. I'm going to be holding down the holding down the B key. It's just a little sticky right now. But if you were to just hit your paint right now, and I've got this color red, I've just chosen a pretty garish color. You can see it here from the same wheel you get whenever you use the color swatch. And you can delineate the radius up here as well, not just interactively by pressing and holding down B. Is totally unresponsive. Okay, seems to be a little bit of a bug. What I've done is, if I paint on the character, plop, there on the face, then I press undo, which is Z, and then I press B, it seems to be responsive, which is, I can tell by that cursor going left and right. So if you're having problems doing that, I guess that's a little weird workaround. Okay, whatever. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose a really ugly red color so that you can see the effect of it painting. And this brush is kind of going over the surface of the geometry. And I think it might be a good idea to also bring up the UV window, UV editor window. So you can kind of see what's going on there too. So this is going to orient me as to where to go and what to do with my character. All right, so you can see that I'm painting on the character, but watch what happens when I get to the arms. Because the arms are, as I paint over it, you can see its update here in the UV window. But as I get to an area where there's shared UVs, like this section of the arms or a section of the legs, it's going to paint them both simultaneously. It's going to update the minute I'm done painting, but you need to understand that there's sections. If you have sections of arms, for instance, that are using the same UV set, you're going to paint them simultaneously, both arms. Now this body is asymmetrical. It got totally laid out, so it's not going to track perfectly. So I need to be careful about what I'm doing. If I'm going to create a spot there, it's actually going into the seam here and up here, but it's also creating something simultaneously on this side that has no equivalent tracking. So I need to be careful about making sure there's consistency. So if I come in and just do undo all over this character, then I'm ready to start painting in what's important to me, which is just these dark patches. So if I were to paint this in, maybe I give myself more of a hard edge. You can see it's painting over the character's texture simultaneously. But this allows me the advantage of coming in and painting right on the geometry, which is kind of cool. And even if I don't do a fine-tuned bit of work here, what I can do is I can fine-tune it in Photoshop later. So if I want to create some nice rounded shapes, I just hold down my cursor, make it go over the whole of the back. And really what I can also do is finally take something where you've got several seams like this butt and just paint it. And you can see that it's putting paint in several different areas that would be incredibly hard for me to try and resolve if I were just doing it in Photoshop. Let's let me go into the arm, paint kind of in there a little bit. You know, again, trying to get that continuity. And its effect, I need to make sure is that I'm trading out nicely. So if I paint on the arms, it needs to go on both arms. I see that effect. And I'm going to come in here and maybe paint in a wider swath, because this is really a low poly character, so you're going to see him from quite a distance. So I may play with those colors and try to make them a little more interesting. But areas down here like the hooves, I can come in and choose a different color. Let's go with a very weird kind of blue, maybe slate. Yeah. And so down here I've got the hooves, and you can see I'm painting one, I'm painting both. And if I want a firmer radius, a firm line of delineation, I can pop between these two different colors and just try to make sure that I've got all of these different sections painted equally. Sometimes you might have to go over it and again just kind of dictate what you want in Photoshop and follow it around, or you can even redo your UVs. So it's a pretty nice process to come in and just determine and fix also where your edges are. So I want to grab this color here, gray, that particular gray, can come into the legs and try to paint out that gray. And even if it's not perfect, what I do have is the chance to go in Photoshop and kind of see and dictate the area that I need to go over by using a more pronounced color. And I can come up here and actually do lighter strokes, so I'm doing more of a blend. And this is okay for detail. It's not perfect. Like you can see this section here, which is very tiny, a little too tiny, but I can even put a bit of a dot in here and just go in and actually type in something that's going to get me the size I'm looking for. Okay, so I got just a tiny brush and I'm able to do a little more fine-tuned work. And I can also grab things such as, let's say, colors that are not blending very well, and I can try and smooth them over. So the stretching that naturally happens by projections, you can come in here and kind of mess around with that further, but this is a pretty good way to get a color, like a solid color, and just fix some of the seams up that you got on your character, like so. It's gonna be a slightly better blend. You can get rid of little patches here that are not desired from things like projections, but it's really nice to paint directly on your character. I find it's really good to hide seams. That's one of the best things you can do. Again, this is a somewhat uncomplex character. It's not necessarily he doesn't have a lot of detail going on, so I'm able to paint some of this stuff out pretty easily, which is nice, and then I can come in and be more specific in other areas. But that's pretty much it whenever you use the 3D Paint tool. And here's what you want to do when you're done. You can save the texture, and then remember that this is no longer accessing the original texture you gave it. It is in fact accessing a new texture that it made as a copy. So if you're curious where that is, you can come into your texture here, follow it down the rabbit hole, and see that it's now, the minute you started painting, it actually started, it made its own subdirectory, 3D Paint Textures. It made a further subdirectory based upon the mesh name, so you could do this with several meshes in the same scene. And then ultimately it made a copy of the PSD file. So this is the new PSD file that it's manipulating every time you paint on this character. So don't just open up your old file and say, oh, I expect it to be perfect, and have the changes I've asked for. So let's get rid of this stuff. I got about 1 million of them here. And this is also an advantage to making sure you have consistency in your characters. Okay, so we have 3D Paint Test, and that was done earlier this morning, so I'm just going to delete that. And I'm going to instead go in this directory here. The reason I know to delete that one, not this one, is 7:55, so that was done just a minute ago. And I can open this, and this has all the changes in the hoof, the nose, everything. It's really nicely laid out. And if I want further information on where where the UVs are, I can come up and read in a UV snapshot that I made earlier, and I can just say that is something to darken, like so, and just use it as a point of reference to say, did I get all the places that I needed to? See that little fine ring of gray that we put in there? That would have been hard to do, and it was much easier to do it here in Maya. So I don't recommend you paint detail in at this point, but I do recommend that you can use this for smoothing out seams if they're really obvious. And that's what you can do. And there you go.